This is what the UFC Flyweight Rankings looked like in February 2013. Demetrious Johnson, the champion, won the title against Joseph Benavidez and then successfully defended it against John Dodson. The flyweight division is such a weird division in the UFC, and we've seen it in the past month that right now it's on life support. So let's see how the flyweight division went from what it looks like in February 2013 to now, because a lot has changed. So let's get into it. UYENOYAMA was TKO'd by Joseph Benavidez, dropping him one spot. John LINEKER then TKO'd GASHIMOV, bumping him up one spot. FORMIGA then got a decision win over CARIASO. Demetrious Johnson then submitted John MORAGA to successfully defend his title. John LINEKER then TKO'd Jose Maria TOME. It was a catchweight fight though, so he only bumped up one spot. McCALL then got a decision win over SANTOS, but that didn't change anything. Tim Elliott got a decision win over GAUDINOT, bumping himself up 3 spots to get into the top 10. Joseph Benavidez then TKO'd FORMIGA, bumping FORMIGA down 1 spot and LINEKER up 1 spot. CARIASO TKO'd SANTOS, and then John Dodson TKO'd MONTAGUE. John LINEKER TKO'd Phil Harris, but didn't change in the rankings because again he missed weight. BAGAUTINOV got a decision win over Tim Elliott, bumping BAGAUTINOV into the top 10. A random shuffle put Elliott and BAGAUTINOV up 1 and CARIASO down 2 spots. MAKOVSKY got a decision win over JORGENSEN, bumping MAKOVSKY into the top 10 and GAUDINOT out of the rankings. Demetrious Johnson then KO'd the number 1 contender Joseph Benavidez. That dropped Benavidez down 1 spot to number 2. And this is what the UFC Flyweight Rankings looked like at the end of 2013. Demetrious Johnson establishing himself as a dominant champion, getting 2 title wins, and knocking out his stiffest competition in Joseph Benavidez. We also saw John LINEKER climb the rankings, but miss weight in 2 consecutive fights. We'll see what happens with LINEKER in 2014. To start 2014, John MORAGA got a decision win over Dustin ORTIZ. Then CARIASO got a decision win over Danny Martinez. BAGAUTINOV got a decision win over John LINEKER, bumping him up into the top 5 and LINEKER out of the top 5. MAKOVSKY then got a decision win over Josh Sampo. FORMIGA got a submission win over Scott Jorgensen, bumping FORMIGA up 1 and LINEKER continue going downwards. A random shuffle put MAKOVSKY up 1 spot and CARIASO down 1 spot. Joseph Benavidez then submitted Tim Elliott. CARIASO got a decision win over Luis Smolka, putting CARIASO up 2 and Tim Elliott down 2. BAGAUTINOV was then in line for a title shot against Demetrious Johnson, which bumped him up a spot. John Dodson then got a TKO over John MORAGA. Demetrious Johnson defended his title, getting a decision win over BAGAUTINOV. A random shuffle put Brad Pickett into the top 10 and Tim Elliott out of the top 10. John LINEKER then TKO'd OZKILIC and made weight for the fight. McCALL then got a decision win over Brad Pickett. FORMIGA then got a decision win over MAKOVSKY, bumping FORMIGA up 2 spots and MAKOVSKY down 1 spot. John MORAGA submitted Justin SCOGGINS. Demetrious Johnson then submitted CARIASO to defend his flyweight championship. CAMUS then got a decision win over Brad Pickett, bumping Pickett out of the top 10 and Elliott back into the top 10. Joseph Benavidez then submitted Dustin ORTIZ. John MORAGA then submitted Willie Gates, bumping MORAGA up 1 spot. And at the end of 2014, this is what the UFC Flyweight Rankings looked like. In 2014, we saw BAGAUTINOV climb the rankings, but drop in the rankings after losing to Johnson. FORMIGA and MORAGA were able to establish themselves as top 5 fighters, but other than that, not a whole lot changed in the flyweight rankings. To start off 2015, Kyoji Horiguchi gets a decision win over Luis GAUDINOT, which bumps Horiguchi up to the number 8 spot. John LINEKER then gets the decision win over McCALL, but misses weight yet again. MAKOVSKY gets a decision win over Tim Elliott, which puts MAKOVSKY up 1 spot. Henry Cejudo then makes his debut in the top 10 by getting a decision win over CARIASO. A random shuffle puts FORMIGA ahead of MORAGA in the top 5. Ali BAGAUTINOV was then removed from the rankings after failing a drug test for his fight against Demetrious Johnson. Demetrious Johnson then defended his title, submitting Kyoji Horiguchi. John Dodson got a decision win over Zach MAKOVSKY, dropping MAKOVSKY down 1 spot. Joseph Benavidez then got a decision win over John MORAGA. FORMIGA got a decision win over Wilson Hayes, which bumped up FORMIGA 1 spot and McCALL down 1 spot. Henry Cejudo then got a decision win over CAMUS, bumping him up 3 spots to get into the top 5 at flyweight. Dustin Ortiz then TKO'd Willie Gates, which put Ortiz up 1 spot. John LINEKER then submitted Jimmy Rivera at bantamweight, which dropped LINEKER off of the flyweight rankings. Demetrious Johnson then got a decision win over the number 1 contender, John Dodson, defending his title yet again. Horiguchi then submitted CAMUS, bumping Horiguchi up 1 spot. Sergio Pettis then got a decision win over Chris CARIASO, which dropped CARIASO from the top 10 rankings. Joseph Benavidez then got a decision win over Ali BAGAUTINOV, which moved Benavidez ahead of John Dodson to the number 1 spot. Henry Cejudo then got a decision win over FORMIGA, bumping Cejudo up 2 spots to number 3 at flyweight. And at the end of 2015, this is what the UFC Flyweight Rankings look like. When I said we needed that added spice in the division, we got it in 2 fighters, Henry Cejudo climbing the rankings from nothing to something up to number 3, and Horiguchi, even though he was rushed to a title shot this year, was able to crack the top 10. We also got the removal of a promising flyweight, John LINEKER, who just couldn't continue to make weight and had to go up to bantamweight. Now before we move on to 2016, please, if you can, go down and like the video and subscribe to SBN MMA. We put out a lot of good content, and I have the pound for pound rankings coming up in a bit, so please like the video and subscribe so that you can see that video in your subscription box. Alright, let's get on to 2016. We start off 2016 with Wilson Hayes getting a decision win over Dustin Ortiz, which gives Hayes his debut in the top 10. A random shuffle puts Ray Borg out of the top 10 and Dustin Ortiz back into it. Joseph Benavidez then gets a decision win over Zach MAKOVSKY. And then a shocking change to the flyweight division, John Dodson moves to bantamweight, TKOing Manny Gamburian, and he is dropped from the flyweight rankings. Demetrious Johnson then successfully defends his title, TKOing Henry Cejudo. Horiguchi then gets a decision win over SEERY, bumping him up to the number 4 spot at flyweight. BAGAUTINOV gets a decision win over Herrera, which puts BAGAUTINOV up 1 spot. Wilson Hayes submits Hector Sandoval, but that doesn't change anything. Matheus Nicola gets a decision win over John MORAGA, which drops MORAGA 3 spots. Luis Smolka gets a TKO win over Ben Nguyen, which puts Smolka up into the top 10 at number 9. A random shuffle puts Wilson Hayes 1 spot ahead of Zach MAKOVSKY. Pucier FORMIGA then gets a decision win over Dustin Ortiz. Brandon Moreno then submits Luis Smolka, which drops Smolka out of the top 10 rankings. Nicola then gets hit by USADA, dropping him from the rankings and bringing Dustin Ortiz back into the top 10. Ian McCall was then pulled from his fight against SEERY because of an illness, bumping McCall down 1 spot in the rankings. Horiguchi then got a decision win over BAGAUTINOV, bumping Horiguchi up to the number 3 spot at flyweight. Brandon Moreno then got a decision win over Ryan Benoit, giving Moreno his top 10 debut. Joseph Benavidez then got a decision win over Henry Cejudo in a number 1 versus number 2 fight. Demetrious Johnson then defended his title against Tim Elliott, who got the title shot by winning the tough flyweight season. Dustin Ortiz then got a decision win over Zach MAKOVSKY, dropping MAKOVSKY off of the top 10 rankings. Ray Borg then got a decision win over Luis Smolka, which put Ray Borg back up into the top 10 of the flyweight rankings. And at the end of 2016, this is what the UFC Flyweight Rankings look like. We had a couple of major fights in the top 3 of the division, with Demetrious Johnson beating Henry Cejudo and Joseph Benavidez beating Henry Cejudo. Horiguchi continued to climb the rankings, but doesn't look like he's going to get that title shot anytime soon due to his previous loss to Johnson. Wilson Hayes also moved his way up into the top 5 of the flyweight division. To start off 2017, Sergio Pettis defeated John MORAGA, taking MORAGA off of the top 10 and putting Pettis up to number 8. Ali BAGAUTINOV then leaves the UFC, which removes him from the UFC's flyweight rankings. Ian McCALL is then again removed from a fight due to illness. He is then bumped down one spot at flyweight. Wilson Hayes gets a decision win over Ulka Sasaki. Kyoji Horiguchi then leaves the UFC to go fight overseas for Rizin. That removes him from the UFC flyweight rankings. Ray Borg then gets a decision win over Jussier Formiga, which bumps Ray Borg up 4 spots and drops Formiga down 2 spots. Tim Elliott then gets a decision win over Luis Smolka, bringing him up 3 spots to the number 7 position at flyweight. Demetrious Johnson then submits Wilson Hayes, dropping Hayes down 1 spot to number 4. Brandon Moreno then gets a submission win over Dustin Ortiz, moving him up 3 spots to the number 7 position. Ben Wynn submits Tim Elliott, removing Elliott from the rankings and giving Wynn his top 10 debut. John Moraga gets a decision win over Mokhtarian, which moves him back into the top 10, and Ian McCall is now out of the top 10 flyweight rankings. Sergio Pettis then gets a decision win over Brandon Moreno, which puts Sergio Pettis to the number 4 spot. Henry Cejudo then TKO's Wilson Hayes, which drops Hayes from the top 5 of the UFC flyweight division. Jussier Formiga then submits Sasaki, which doesn't change anything. John Moraga then KO's Bibulatov, which moves him up 1 spot, and Dustin Ortiz down 1 spot. Demetrious Johnson yet again defends his title, this time against Ray Borg, which doesn't change anything. Henry Cejudo then gets a decision win over Sergio Pettis, dropping Pettis down 1 spot. And at the end of 2017, this is what the UFC flyweight rankings look like. The story of 2017 is fighters leaving the UFC. Horiguchi, a top 3 fighter at flyweight, leaving the UFC to go fight for Rizin. We also saw Ali BAGAUTINOV, a former title challenger who is climbing his way back up, removed from the rankings to go fight in Russia. On a positive note, we did see Ray Borg and Sergio Pettis climb the rankings, although both fighters at the end of the year received losses from top 3 fighters. Now, the flyweight division up until this point hasn't seen a drastic change that has just shook the division, other than Dodson leaving the division. But 2018, yeah, this is where things shake up. Dustin Ortiz gets a decision win over Alexandre Pantoja, which bumps Ortiz up 1 spot. Jussier Formiga then gets a submission win over Ben Wynn. John Moraga then gets a decision win over Wilson Hayes, moving Moraga up 4 spots and Wilson Hayes down 2 spots. Alexandre Pantoja then gets a decision win over Brandon Moreno, introducing Pantoja to the top 10 of the flyweight division. Sergio Pettis then gets a decision win over Joseph Benavidez. Benavidez's first loss to someone not named Demetrious Johnson. Pettis up 3 spots to the number 2 spot at flyweight. Dustin Ortiz KO's Nicola, which bumps Ortiz up 1 spot to number 9. Henry Cejudo then becomes UFC flyweight champion, getting a narrow decision win over Demetrious Johnson. Demetrious Johnson bumped out of his championship position. Davison Figueiredo then TKO's John Moraga, bumping him up 8 spots to the number 6 position. A random shuffle puts Dustin Ortiz ahead of Pantoja. Then Jussier Formiga gets a decision win over Sergio Pettis, moving Formiga up to the number 2 spot at flyweight. Then yet another shocker, Demetrious Johnson is traded to one championship for Ben Askren. That removes him from the UFC flyweight rankings. Now, I say this is where we are in November 2018, but I'm not actually sure that's where we are, because right now, the flyweight division is actually on hold. There may no longer be a flyweight division. Henry Cejudo is going to fight TJ Dillashaw, and from what it sounds like, that's going to be the last flyweight fight in flyweight history. Some fighters have already been removed from the UFC rankings, have been cut from the UFC. There's a lot going on right now that day by day, as I'm publishing this video, as I'm making this video, things in the flyweight division are changing without fighters actually fighting. So right now the division is in just the most chaos that a division could be, and just topped off by Demetrious Johnson, the longtime reigning champion, the person who kept the division afloat, not only losing his title, but leaving the UFC. Thank you so much for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing what actually happens with the flyweight division because, yeah, we're in the middle of just a crazy time for the division. Anyways, if you like this video, please give it a like down below and consider subscribing to SBN MMA. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in the rankings.